Ready. Can you put in the chat that we're waiting 10 minutes, or just another 4 minutes because there's can they? Okay, there's a graduation on campus, and we've got a great difficulty with people getting onto campus and finding parking. So we're just waiting a few minutes. So sorry for the people online for the delay. We are, as I said, just giving it a few minutes because of the graduation on campus, which is causing a big backlog in getting onto campus and parking. It's not a Wits graduation, by the way, but the Linda Auditorium gets used by a lot of private colleges and institutions. So unfortunately, it does create a bit of chaos. So I was going to do this a little bit later, but I'm just swapping my order a little bit. You've all got cards in front of you. And while we are waiting to start, I want you all to pick up the green card that is in front of you. Those of you who are online, I'd like you to just write in the chat, and we've got people who are monitoring the chat, and they are going to write up what you've written on a green card. So on your, oh my goodness, Anthony doesn't have a green card. Trust Anthony to be difficult. Okay. Try and find a green card if you don't have one, otherwise you can use a blue one. I would like you to write on your card why you think the idea of skills ecosystems is important or useful. So what do you think about the idea of skills ecosystems? We're going to collect them and we're going to put them up later. And you'll see you've got some other cards, and we are going to be using them throughout the morning because it is a long session and we want it to be interactive, including for the people online. So people online, please do respond in the chat and tell us or write on your card why you think the idea of skills ecosystems is important or useful while we are waiting for the stragglers to arrive. And when you've done that, you can just pass them forward and we'll collect them all. Yeah. Those who came late, please find out what you're supposed to be doing from the people next to you.
This is a crime. Okay, I can't.
What's wrong?
She just emailed her slides, but I need to access Haley. I need to access Victoria's laptop.
All right, everyone. We are exactly 15 minutes late. And I believe that is appropriate because we have a German visitor with us for the week, Professor Michael Gessler from Bremen University. And he, some of you were at his seminar last week. And he said that in Germany, in academic events, it is culturally correct to start 15 minutes late. So although we at the bottom of Africa like to start exactly on time, usually, today we accommodated the German academic culture for Michael and also for the graduation on campus. Morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Allais. I'm the Saatchi Research Chair of Skills Development here at the WITS Center for Researching Education and Labor. And I want to welcome you all, those who are in the room and those who are joining us online, to this seminar. We have a wonderful panel lined up this morning, who I'll introduce in a second. And we also have an incredible collection of people in the audience, including international visitors, some who have been with us throughout the week looking at skills ecosystems. We have also Tama from the Open University Network. But I want to just, I don't want to welcome too many people by name. I actually just want to welcome one person in the audience by name. And that is Professor Yael Shalem, who it's her first time back on campus for some time. She's been ill, and she is now well again, and we are very, very, very happy to have her back. She is the intellectual spine of the Real Center. We really can't do without her. And we are very, very happy to have you back, Yael. Welcome. It's her first day back. Give her another round of applause. Okay, so moving along, everyone's written on their green cards why they think the idea of skills ecosystems is important. It certainly struck us in recent months that the idea of skills ecosystems comes up a lot. There's a lot of people who are working with the idea, using the idea, and sometimes in quite different ways. And that's why we've had a workshop that's really been looking at some PhD students' work, some research projects, and how people are using this idea. And why the idea seems to be capturing some kind of zeitgeist in education policy and in education interventions. One of the reasons that we speculated is just because all of us are increasingly aware of the fragility of ecosystems, the difficulty of sustaining them and building them, and the importance of ecosystems as the climate crisis kind of intensifies. So I think that that's perhaps one reason. But I think also that if you think about the social sciences as a whole, and education in particular, there's two kind of very different theoretical starting points or conceptual starting points to analysis. And the one starts from individuals or individual units, and the other starts from systems, relations, and institutions. So, for example, economics tends to be underpinned by kind of methodological individualism, which looks at the individual units and aggregates them up, whereas sociology tends to look more relationally, and political economy tends to look more institutionally. And both of those sets of ideas are influential in education, and both of them can be useful in education. So methodological individualism, where you start from individual humans, their individual sets of skills, manifests itself most prominently in education theory through the idea of human capital theory, which is very, very dominant in education policy, often not explicitly. So a lot of people who are working in the education policy space sort of have imbibed it as the kind of water that they swim in without necessarily critiquing it. And it can be useful. It's useful, for example, when we want to look at which individuals are earning more and how does that relate to different education qualifications. Where it's less useful is explaining change over time, but it's also less useful in planning educational interventions. Because when we're thinking about educational interventions, we really have to think about systems, about institutions, about relationships, about bodies of knowledge, etc. So I think that's another reason why the idea of a set of ideas that really focus on relationships perhaps is really coming to dominate a lot of work in the education space, but in particular in the space of people who are really focused on trying to think about the relationship between skills and the just transition that we are all aspiring to, and maybe trying to find ways of working towards. So I think that that's just by way of introduction. I just want to very briefly introduce our panel, starting with the director of the Real Center, Dr. Prisha Ramsarup, who is a very leading researcher in skills and just transitions. Professor Haler, I'm not going to pronounce your surname. She'll say it. Say it quickly. Yeah, what she said. She's a distinguished professor of education from Rhodes University, longtime collaborator of the Real Center, and really leading light internationally on environmental education. Then we have Professor Volker Wedekind, head of the School of Education at the University of Nottingham, but much more importantly than that, former staff member of the Real Center, and still a collaborator with us at the Real Center. Then we have Professor Ken Spoers, who is from the famous Institute of Education at University College London. Those of you who joined us on our online seminar series in 2021, many people attended his seminar. It was one of the really well-attended ones. So we've been working with Ken. He's done a lot of work in this area, and we're very, very grateful that he flew out to be with us this week in Johannesburg. And last but definitely not least, Professor Simon McGrath, Professor of Education at the University of Glasgow, and also long-time collaborator with us at the Real Centre, and much before his history with us at the Real Centre, very, very long working history in South Africa and Africa, looking at education, vocational education, and development. So it's an exciting panel. I'm going to be putting them through their paces, but also asking for contribution from the audience this morning, and I hope it's going to be an interesting and useful morning. We're going to start by giving them each about 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, to reflect on, from their perspective, why they think the idea of skills ecosystems is important and useful.
Okay. Morning, everybody. So I'm going to start with taking stock of where we are now. So if we look at where we are now in terms of trying to understand skills and sustainability, the first point that we've learned from all the research that we've done is that the skills system and education and training in general has been extremely reactive, inadequate, inefficient, and fragmented. The skill system in South Africa is struggles to engage with a cross-cutting issue. So if it's not sector-based, if it's not located in a particular, if it's across sectors and across groupings of people, it's very hard for the skills system and skills information to be able to understand what is actually happening. We have very poor occupational information. It's hard for us to understand occupations, okay? And another issue is that a lot of our thinking is around qualifications. And if we have qualifications, then the job will tend to exist. So if once we have a qualification, the occupation will then exist. That's the kind of thinking that exists in the skills system at the moment, which we see gives us more qualifications. I was in a session last week that told me, we're going to need 24 new qualifications for hydrogen. Like, what? Okay? And that's where we are at the moment. So we have a skills system that is uncoordinated, that is struggling to cope. Okay? And the thing to understand from that, there are no quick wins in that type of situation. There's no quick fixes. You can't bolt new qualifications into a system that's struggling. And the only way to start to understand it is to actually understand the skill formation system and to understand how the different parts of the skill formation system fits together. The skill formation system in South Africa is complex, and the system is made up of multiple different actors, multiple different relationships, and multiple different institutions. And starting thinking about skills from that basis, the different actors, the different relationships between the actors, the regulation that's happening, the mechanisms that's being used, the policy, understanding the dynamics and the relationship and the processes that hold that together is the core of skills formation. And that centrally then means that skill formation is not an individualized activity. It is not an activity about training individuals, okay? Training in individuals has no longevity, okay? It doesn't help us to build a system. Or it's one part of how we're starting to build a system. So, if we think about this complex system, if we think about the problems of where we are in the system, and we think about all the, let's say, demands that and the urgency that the just transition is actually putting before us, it begs the question then, what type of skills responses do we need? How should we be thinking? Okay? And what we have found is that we need skills responses that are helping us to look at the skill formation system, that's helping us to investigate institutions and their relationships to each other, that's helping us to develop a systemic perspective, okay? Not just individualist notions of skills. We'll train 5,000 people, but we're not really sure about where these 5,000 people are going to transition to. We need to understand a more relational approach to skills. We need to be able to understand both at micro and macro perspectives. We need to be able to research in the present, but be able to think about the future. So we need that type of perspective as we're working. And we need something that can deal with short-term and be able to understand the short-term needs that we have in terms of the 3 core value chains, but also has a long-term perspective and is contributing towards building a system. Which is why in our analytic work, it's led us to some of the work on skill formation systems, because it's a place-based, it's a useful approach. It helps us to understand skills ecosystems, both relationally. It helps us to look across the system, but it gives us a way to look bottom up, okay? To start from communities and actually understand not just at a macro level what the sector is saying or the employers are saying, but it gives us tools to be able to understand, and it gives us explanatory tools to deal with what are we learning about skills planning from the bottom up. I think I'll stop there. I'll probably use my 5 minutes. So thanks, Steph.
Thanks, Prisha. Next up,
Good morning. Thank you, Hayla. I can tell someone was a primary teacher in the room. She gets the cues. So 5 years ago, along with Steph and Prisha and Hayla and Volker and colleagues in Uganda, we received about 20 million rand research grant to look at skills development in Africa and to try and work towards new approaches to it. And we had 2 cases each in South Africa and Uganda. And we tried to select cases that showed diversity of skills in different locations to show that skill systems have to be understood in context. And we had oil, and we had maritime, but we also had informal, urban, and subsistence rural settings in that. And these were also diverse in terms of the skills systems, the skills formation that was going on. We had formal and informal enterprise-based training of a whole range of scales, from huge transnational companies through to street traders. We had public providers, but also private providers. We had churches. We had colleges that belonged to other ministries, not ministries of education, such as agricultural colleges. And we could see lots of informal vocational learning going on. Even in quite poor communities, the use of YouTube to learn a new hairstyle, to learn a new type of food dish to prepare. And so just that sense that skills actually is a very complex area with lots of different things happening, and that we need to get beyond traditional ways of thinking about that. But each of these cases also had drivers, and different drivers. So in the maritime and transport sector in South Africa, around eThekwini, of course, the SIPs, the massive government structural infrastructure programs were doing major investments. And of course, some of what's being talked about with the just energy transition equal massive mega projects by the state. In Western Uganda, oil was about to be exploited. Again, huge scale interventions in the local economy, in the local society, and of course in the local education and training system. So these drivers, in other cases it was about local economic development as somewhere got city status, and what does that mean now that we're a city? What do we start to try and do as a city that was different from just being a municipality around the area of skills? And of course all of these had different relationships to the state and different relationships to local and international capital. So this led us to thinking that an ecosystems and a social ecosystems approach, which Ken will say more about in a minute, was important because it allowed us different insights into dealing with those complexities, because each case was different. Yes, there were elements of human capital operating. Yes, there were elements of traditional political economy operating. Traditional sociological analysis could take you so far, but there's a complexity that went beyond all those traditional ways of looking at this because of all these complex forces bearing down on systems, and then uneven local networks that were responding to those forces, but also with their own imperatives at the local level. And this allowed us to think about power, who was powerful in each network, which powers were bearing down on the system, but also inclusion and exclusion. And it's not simple as who's in and who's out of a labour market, but that labour markets are quite segmented. Learning systems, I talked about diversity of learning, but all learning is not equal in terms of, for instance, its labour market power, its economic status, its social status, and so understanding that there were multiple inclusions and exclusions going on, but also the importance of particular agents, particular actors in a system, who some had more power already, some had more skill in leading things, but that there were things going on in terms of who were the people who were initiating networks, but also maintaining networks, but also that networks were inherently fragile and dynamic, and that changes could happen in them. So those are just some thoughts of why we started to think about it, and then as we started to use it, we tried to move it over more and more into thinking about just transitions, but we were also researching at the time of COVID, and so unsurprisingly, we didn't get quite as far as we wanted with some of the things we were doing, but that feels like a next generation of that. But anyway, there's some thoughts from me.
Thanks, Simon. And next up is Ken.
Yes, he's got...
All right. Okay. That's very good. I'd like to introduce briefly the social ecosystem model, which is a particular interpretation of skills ecosystems. And what I want to do very briefly is introduce you to the two elements. First of all, what I consider to be an expansion of skills ecosystems to include living. So it's not just working and learning, it's working, living and learning. And the living part arose out of our observations of research in East London of the social displacement of the working class by fintech developments. So we're really interested in social displacement and how to have stability in communities, which are now represented by concepts such as 20-minute cities. So that's the first part. That I maintain that's an expansion, yes, of the original skills ecosystem model. The second part, and this is the part I think that's proven in discussions over the last few days to be equally, if not more powerful, is a 45-degree framework comprising the dynamic of two dimensions. The vertical relationships of governmental state and the horizontal relationships of civil society. Now, this neo-Gramscian framework of state and civil society in the expanded state helps us understand two things. One, how horizontal relationships are dominated by vertical relationships and the exact nature of that domination. And secondly, the struggles and tasks to build active horizontalities, what we call advanced or organized horizontalities, which in fact is the revolutionary effort, if you actually want to look at it that way. What I want to talk about briefly now is the role of 45-degree mediation, which arises from the Gramscian concept of the role of organic intellectuals. But here, I'm not simply talking about one set of people, or one set of actors. What these last few days have revealed is the multiplicity of actors who act in a mediating role. And by mediation, I am referring to the active organization of the balance of relationships between the vertical and the horizontal in order to produce, in ecological terms or ecosystem terms, a new equilibrium, or in political economy terms, a new political, economic, social settlement. And looking very briefly at the green part of this diagram, the discussions over the last few days have revealed the multiplicity of actors and forces in the mediation 45-degree zone. And so the metaphor that this has led to is this concept of the distinction between the big tent and the festival campsite. It is often the case that in governmental state, that particular state actors want to produce a new big tent, yeah, that's going to transform everything, and invite people into the tent. Yeah? There's only one tent, you're either inside the tent or you're outside the tent. It's actually not a very democratic concept. So, in Compass, that's the political organisation of which I'm a part in the UK, we talk about the Glastonbury Festival campsite, in which there are different stages of different sizes, there are different tents of different sizes, they have different functions, and then in the festival, you can imagine at the end, there is a unifying spirit. So to quote Togliatti, unity in diversity. So having diversity doesn't mean that you can't have unity, but it's unified, not uniform. And so the idea here, the central idea of this particular contribution, is to talk about the multiplicity of mediating forces in their relationships in order to resolve these tensions between the governmental state and civil society, where we are actively trying to build a very vibrant, advanced, and ultimately transformatory horizontal.
Thank you. Next up is Volker.
Just close it.
Can't I leave it?
Oh, yeah, you can.
So I wanted to drill down a little bit and talk about some of the institutional actors on that horizontal plane. And specifically in the South African context, think about colleges or TVET colleges. And Simon's alluded to that in relation to some of the empirical work that we're doing. Because I think the thinking about colleges in the context of an ecosystem is helpful both to center them in some ways, because we could potentially think about them as an anchor institution within this kind of space. And if we were, or maybe one of the key stages within this campsite that Ken's articulating. But I think in some ways it also decenters the college in the way in which we think about them in South Africa, because we tend to kind of think about the TVET system as a closed system, and we think about our 50 colleges, and we think about what those colleges should do and what curriculum they need to deliver. And the ecosystem thinking in relation to colleges disrupts that a little bit and decenters the college within a much bigger system, both in terms of other institutions that are in that system and the kinds of relations that the college needs to have, those horizontal relations within civil society, and the way in which the colleges connect into the wider space of the ecosystem, either through mediations that come from the vertical aspect here, or in terms of the kind of horizontal relations that colleges need to have with other training providers, but also crucially with industry, employers, entrepreneurs, and so on. And that then starts to pose questions about what the role of the college is within this ecosystem that goes beyond just the formal delivery of programs that are often decontextualized from the locality. So I think that the ecosystem thinking helps us to disrupt some of our focus on colleges in a very narrow sort of institutional way. And I think it's more helpful for us to think about colleges, and I'm using colleges generically here because in our work, TVET colleges would be one actor, but in some cases, the anchor institution might be a private TVET provider. It might be in relation to certain occupations. It might be some other kind of college. Simon mentioned agricultural colleges, or in the other case studies that we've been looking at would be maritime colleges and specialized institutions like that. And we might be talking also about university level institutions like universities of technology or universities. So thinking ecosystemically means we start looking at all of the institutions within this space and the relationships between them, rather than thinking narrowly about how do we reform or fix a particular sector within the system. And I think that has been a useful disruptor within my thinking, and I think it's something that is helpful for us to think about in terms of the South African system. But it also then poses challenges in terms of what kinds of capacities do TVET colleges need, and do the people in those colleges need to have in order to play the kind of role that I'm suggesting they would need to play along that horizontal. The ability to connect outside of the formal education institution into the labor market, into other training spaces, the collaborations that might be possible between different types of education institutions or skill providers within that system. What kinds of qualifications and learning is necessary in those institutions, and thinking about colleges not as a national system only, but also very much as campuses in particular locales, and what is the ecosystem that they feed into. And too many of our colleges in the South African system are quite disconnected from the locality, other than in terms of where they draw their students from. But they might be offering programs where there are no employers in the region that those students can connect into, for example. And so ecosystemic thinking, I think, helps us to think about TVET as a system in a slightly different way.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I heard that the Glastonbury Festival tickets were sold out in less than an hour, 57 minutes the other day. So there might be something in the popularity of the small tent metaphor. I'm going to just share very briefly our interest in this particular approach and how we came to it. I work at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape, and we were working with these smallholder farmers who'd got back the land and they had no water. And we found this complete sort of like contradiction in that the Water Research Commission had actually been producing all of this scientific knowledge about rainwater harvesting and conservation, and it had literally got stuck on the shelves of the agricultural college. The lecturers themselves had very little knowledge of rainwater harvesting and conservation practices. The farmers also had fragmented understanding and knowledge of these, and we thought that surely there must be a way of trying to respond to these kinds of skills problems that we are sitting with currently in South Africa, as Volker said. So we actually were trying to find a more responsive, co-engaged and generative form of skills planning and development, because our observation also into the agricultural training institutions and so on is that much is very top-down. They have top-down curriculums, they have a kind of top-down history of monoculture, which excludes the small-scale farmer, and very little responsiveness to the context, and yet the demand for their support is actually very high.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask you to speak up? Those of us who've got the air
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm actually a bit tired, but let me try my best. Sorry. Okay, I'll try with the teacher's voice. So what I was just saying is that we were looking for an approach that was more responsive and less less stranglehold, if I can say, by the historicity of top-downness in our society. So we were trying to look for another scale or unit of analysis for co-engaged and generative research, where we could proactively advance skills for sustainability and social justice in transitioning systems. And we were also looking for a way to avoid the over-reliance or heavy dependence on what Steph was talking about, the human capital model, which tends to focus only on the skills for the economy. What about the skills that are necessary just for life and livelihoods? They are equally important, but they don't always carry the monetary economy, but they are nevertheless equally important in the local economies, and especially when you get to food systems and that kind of an issue. And of course, the current economic frameworks are neither equitable nor sustainable, so that you also have a contradiction if you're trying to do sustainability work and you're only focusing in that direction. So you, in a way, have to broaden your way of thinking. And we were also interested in transformative skills development research that actually helps to respond to some of the challenges in the contexts. Kate, how do I move this thing on? Just with the... Oh, okay. Yes, so that was really the problem that we were trying to respond to. How to deal with the overly generic top-down skills planning when issues are emergent and oftentimes place-based, geospatially framed, and also quite complex. And so we thought we needed a different kind of way of thinking about skills development and planning. We looked at the different kinds and models and approaches. Most of the ones that we use in this country are top-down. And if they are bottom-up, they tend to be company-centered. And what do we do if it's not just a company, but if it's actually a range of participating local organizations? We found that it was the local economic development office, plus the extension service, plus the TVET college, plus the farmers associations that were actually trying to do something to assist the farmers. And in this particular local economic development context, which was actually trying to advance the skills and capacities of smallholder farmers. So we were very excited when we found this model, because we were doing a lot of research in this context since 2014, in fact, developing the mediation processes of building the skills ecosystem. But we didn't have the skills system language. And Prisha is always so good at telling us, you know, you need to be able to speak to the skills system. So what skills system language can we use to help us to articulate what we're doing into the national skills system? So we're very excited about this work that Ken and his colleagues had been doing in East London. Our project was also very close to East London, but the one in the Eastern Cape, because we thought that it gave us a way of thinking about place-based, more responsive, linking living, working, and learning, as Ken has told us just now, so the livelihoods and the living of people into the learning systems. So we worked since 2014, and when we met up with Simon and Prisha to start the VET 4.0 project, our first activity was to map out these skills ecosystems that we had experienced in the field, and this was our map. Lulu will remember. She put in all those top-down arrows there of the different South African policies that are impacting on the smallholder farmers and the agricultural colleges. There was the vet college in the middle there. It was an agricultural college. There was also a local vet college, which was also involved in the beginning, but they disappeared after a while. The universities was our university and another university, Fort Hare University. And then there were all of these little organizations, the Dimbaza Farming Trust and the Extension Office, and all sorts of small groups that were supporting dairy farming, and the Zingisa NGO system. And we found so many actors that were actually actively involved in supporting skills development, the farmers associations themselves, and so on. And so what we were able to do over time, and we worked since 2014 on this, we're still working in this particular case study area. And the skills system we've discovered is also extremely dynamic. It changes in form, and the kind of role and relationships in this social ecosystem also change in form over time. So the university partnerships have got stronger with the college. The college and the LED office formed a very strong partnership in the beginning. The LED office has weakened over time, but the college and the university partnership has got stronger. And the extension office got stronger over time, because the extension office was actually supported by this skills ecosystem that we were actively working with. And Tich Pesanaye's research helped us to articulate the mediation processes in this skills ecosystem, and we were able to actually name some of those and articulate them and share them. So it's a very interesting approach, and I wanted to show you this because it is messy, right? And when we do skills planning, we love to use acronyms, and we love to use structures, and we forget about the realities of people on the ground. And so if we can actually work with what's going on the ground, we might learn a lot more about how to do better work in the skills system. And that's really what we've been trying to do, understand the learning pathways, the work streams, the methodologies to better understand what's going on here, how to support the transformative praxis, how to develop the actual local skills ecosystem across these institutions that are going on there. So we've kind of worked into this model. It aligns extremely well with just transition policy. I'm sure you've noticed, Ken. So this is the just transition principles for a just transition in agriculture. And you'll see that they want you to map stakeholders, establish an inclusive process, ensure meaningful participation, build climate knowledge, and involve the role of the unions and other stakeholders. So it really aligns very well with this sort of big policy move that's going on at the moment. But the sort of thing we're finding is that many of the skills system instruments are too narrow. Sydney's PhD is busy opening up that. So the concept of occupation is too narrow. We need to have another way of thinking about that, and so on. And so we've kind of been doing that kind of stuff, trying to think about this 45-degree angle, the mediation processes, who's involved in them, how do you establish them, how do you support them, because mediation doesn't just happen. Of course it does, but if you support expansive learning mediation, you can actually move a system much more quickly. So that kind of work we've been doing, and then starting to work a lot more now with the relationship between cultural historical activity theory and the different activity systems in this landscape, in these skills ecosystems, and how you can actually support, the mediated transformative change in the local skills ecosystem. So that's just a very quick summary of what we've been doing over all these many years, and probably pick up a bit more on some of it later. Thank you.
Thanks, Hela. And Hela has very nicely segued us into our next kind of issue that I want us to focus on this morning, which is the idea of knowledge, expertise, and skill. Because we are talking about skills ecosystems and not ecosystems of any kind. And so that's what we really wanted to bring into the spotlight in the discussion now. I am going to give the audience time to ask questions and comments and make contributions, but before that, I'm going to give my panel another bite at the cherry. But you also have got cards in front of you, so I hope you've all got a yellow card. Does everyone have a yellow card? So just take a minute to write on your yellow card what for you is a key challenge in relation to thinking about knowledge, expertise, and skills, and in relation to skills ecosystems. So take a step into the more directly educational ideas and theories. And those of you again who are online, write it in the chat. We'll write it up for you on a yellow card for you. We're trying to cluster them by themes, so that's why the color coding is important. So write up for us your issues, your concerns, your ideas in relation to expertise and knowledge, because after all, we have education systems and institutions to build expertise and knowledge. And we're thinking about skills ecosystems because that expertise and knowledge is going to be developed somewhere, acquired somewhere, built somewhere, and deployed somewhere. And those processes, I think the ecosystem model helps us to see, are interwoven in complex ways. So if everyone can write that up, their thoughts on knowledge, expertise, skills, and skills ecosystems. And then I'm going to get my panel back, but this time we're going to start with Ken. But Ken, let's just give them one more minute to finish writing, and then we'll start with your
Fine.
Your next input. Okay, so when you've done, you can, we'll come around and collect the cards, but if you could pass them forward, that would make our job a little bit easier. And I'm going to hand over to Ken.
Right, well, I don't have a slide ready for this, so I'll act it out, which is going to be
But you need
amusing.
to talk into the mic
Okay.
for the people online.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I don't have a slide ready for this, so I'll act it out. Right. You remember, yeah, the horizontal and the vertical. And so what I'm going to describe to you now is what I...
Sorry, can you go closer to the
Yeah,
mic? So people are
what-
complaining that they're struggling
okay.
to hear.
What I'm going to talk about now is what I refer to as 45-degree knowledge and skill production. So, going back to those two dimensions, one of the problems is that we can develop forms of specialist knowledge that are separated from each other, that Michael Young and I referred to a long time ago as insular specialization. And therefore we were interested at that time in thinking, was there a more connective form of specialization that would speak to the changes that have happened, certainly accelerated since we talked about these in the early 1990s. So this is the concern with the vertical, right? What's the condition of vertical knowledge and skill? And we therefore made a distinction then between its insular condition and its potentially connective condition. Then I moved to the horizontal. And here, a lot of the debates about knowledge in the horizontal is in fact criticism of what, in fact, Vygotsky refers to as kind of everyday knowledge, yes, or Gramsci calls common sense. That is to say, the fragmented nature of horizontal understanding. And here, I became interested in whether there was a thing called advanced horizontalities. That is to say, forms of knowledge that actually represented what can be referred to as the general intellect. That is to say, shared, socialized consciousness that should be part of everybody's view of the world. People like Mackenzie Walk argue that there's not just one general intellect, there are lots of versions of general intellect. I certainly would support that, but there has to also be some unifying purpose. So, what I am currently doing with these two dimensions, connective specialization on the one hand as opposed to insular, and advanced horizontalities as opposed to base horizontalities, is to see whether they can be combined into what I call organic intellects. The fusion of them produces, and this is an extension really of Gramsci's work. He talked about organic intellectuals, but never got round to talking about the organic intellect. Is it possible to develop a combinational notion of knowledge that combines these two advanced forms? Because the argument is simply this. If we want to change the world, we cannot simply do it from below with horizontal knowledge. It provides us with the ethical political basis, but does not provide us with the expertise. We need vertical knowledge, but vertical knowledge that relates to the concerns, yes, of those in the horizontal. So imagine connective specialization bends towards the horizontal. Advanced horizontalities in terms of general intellect bends towards the vertical. And they constantly interact with each other. And that's what I'm grappling with at the moment, yeah? Those combinations that exist in multiple forms across the arc between the horizontal and the vertical. And I think the implications of this is that actually vet has to contain both. And this is the question, how far does TVET actually produce combinational knowledge that has moral, ethical and social purpose alongside modern connective specializations that speak to the interdisciplinary nature of the world in which we live, and certainly the world that is coming.
Thanks, Ken. Volker, you're next.
Okay, so picking up from that, I think the implications that Ken's articulated there means that within a skills system and an educational program that is developing expertise, we need to understand all the different forms of knowledge that are operational there and value those and work out what the pedagogical strategies are that are needed to develop each of those strands. So developing expertise requires underpinning theoretical knowledge in the particular disciplinary area and the particular occupation. But that doesn't preclude doing quite practical applications of that work and holding those in tension and in balance is one of the real challenges that people have been trying to theorize within the space of vocational education more generally, and particularly in relation to what should be offered in TVETs. And I think being in an education institution, we would probably all agree that skills are not just applied competences, that they've got to be underpinned by a theoretical base. And so the development of that base for people within the system in order to become those organic intellectuals that Ken is talking about is really critical. So, and that has implications for curriculum and how much theoretical knowledge is built into the curriculum, but it also has implications for how we create the opportunities for thinking about what that means in terms of our ethical practice, in terms of solving particular problems in relation to the occupation, what it means for workplace interactions and the interactions between a person in an occupation and the clients, the people that they're interacting with, their customers and so on. And one of the key things within that is that you can't just build that sort of knowledge from what is currently happening on the ground in a particular occupation, because that locks you into the present and into the past. And when we're talking about transitions, we have to be imagining a future. And so it's really, really critical that we don't go down a route where we focus on competence based on the immediate and the present, and giving people skills to act on in occupations on problems in the moment. Because what we've got to start developing is that future orientation that enables people to have the skills to continue to think about the future and to start solving the future problems as they develop within those occupations. And so that then has implications for how we define occupations, how broad they are, what the core skills are within those, and how you integrate those. And all of that, I think, poses a particular challenge for the teachers or the facilitators of learning within a skills system, within a vocational space, and which I think makes a vocational teacher, being a vocational teacher, one of the most complex jobs there are within the education system. And I think we have tended to undervalue that role. And we've thought that we can just take someone with occupational expertise and that they would be the right people to do that kind of training. Or you can take someone with theoretical expertise and put them into a college, take them out of a schooling system, and that they would be able to do that. And neither of those are possible. They're not going to be able to do this kind of integrated holistic development of competence that we need if we are going to progress. So the thinking about teachers within the system and the knowledge that they require, both in terms of their pedagogical knowledge and the ability to facilitate learning and all of the things that we expect teachers to do, but also have that identity in the occupation and imagine what that occupation might be in the future. Having those three components integrated into a teacher identity is a really, really challenging task for all of us to think through as we think about what kinds of skills teachers need in order to develop holistic competences for the future. So.
Thanks, Volker. I'm going to call Simon, and I just want to tell my panelists that unfortunately I believe the mic is actually only working to relay you to the people online.
No.
It is not relaying you to the back of the room. So I am going to ask you all to use your rally voices to reach the back of the room.
With a sore throat, that's an interesting challenge, but let's see what we can do. So I want to follow on from Volker, and I want to talk about one key kind of policy versus academic debate, and which is essentially about what we know, who we are, and how we think we know it. But it's a more practical issue that I wanted to sort of invoke from that. And I want to invoke, well, what do I know and how do I know it? Well, you know, this is based on 30 years of work as an academic and a policy advisor. But I want to compare that with a key set of knowledge claims that keep coming back on a regular basis, partly because of the nature of the policy process with the churn of policy advisors and ministers internationally, that we keep reinventing things, regardless of the evidence. So we actually have about 40 years international evidence regarding attempts to make skills development more demand-led. Demand-led, of course, is important, but it's how that is understood, and particularly in an Anglophone way, because it's not the same way as I think, you know, people like Michael would understand that in a Germanic context. And I think we have to be clear that the systems internationally that most embody a demand-led philosophy are those that are evaluated worst by analysts internationally. And this is because of a few problems about what we know or think we know. So first, how is demand communicated? So this is seen to be simple, but it isn't. So even in one sector, in one region, employers make decisions about technological choices and the organisation of labour. So they don't speak with one voice on skills. They are making decisions based on their traditions as companies. In the East Midlands of England, a major engineering region, very different firms, even along the same highway, are taking different views about the skills mix, about the technology mix. So we need to know that there's never a simple one voice from a sector, and of course, some voices are louder. And typically, the larger, more organised firms can afford to send someone to the key meetings, whereas the smaller family firm can't send that person because they're so vital to keeping the day's work going. So we have a bias in what we think we know about demand because of those reasons. But how do we determine demand in the first place is not as simple as we sometimes think. So in the public sector, states determine the demand for public sector workers, and that is driven by electoral considerations, it's driven by budgetary considerations, and then they define the demand for nurses or teachers depending on what they think they can afford. To give you a concrete example from Scotland at the moment, our teachers' union went on strike, the government did a deal with them, but that reduced the budget. In other parts of education, so now we've lost our CPD budget, and numbers of initial teacher education places have gone down that the government's paying for this semester because they had to increase the teacher salaries to stop the strike. So now they don't need so many teachers this year because they can't afford to need the teachers. So we have to, going back to Keynes, what's effective and ineffective demand? It isn't just demand. And of course, in other sectors, such as oil, we don't know because of volatility of price, when demand for skills will be activated. So we mentioned one of our case studies was in Uganda. So it was the view was Uganda, the oil was going to be exploited. So there's a skills possibility for the Ugandan government. They brought a British consultancy in to say, well, what skills needs would we need? You know, petro engineers, welders who can weld up to the specs needed for a pipeline, which is a long way away from burglar bars, which is what people could do. You know, all these skills. But when was day zero? They thought they had 5 years. Those of us who are commenting on it said, but you can't train those people. You can maybe train them in those times, but you can't make them ready to go into a multinational company in that time. In practice, the decision to invest took another 5 years. They could have developed skills a lot further, but we thought we couldn't possibly get the skills done in time. And the companies, of course, wanted to import anyway. So there's a volatility there. So what we hear is often short-term, it's often retrospective, and of course, not looking at any country in particular, funding regimes massively distort the messages that employers give back. So if you tell employers that there's funding for this, and then ask them to a workplace skills plan, the employers say, oh yeah, that's the skill that I'm short of, because you're going to give me some money. Because, as we know, the whole process of workplace and sector skills plans is partly driven by, on the one hand, it's a tax, as some employers see it. On the other hand, well, I might get some rebates, so I'll say the things that I need to say to get this. But then we get to the data. The data has been socially constructed. It hasn't simply existed before the question was asked in a particular way. And of course, we know that there are wider problems with demand. We know from a huge amount of academic evidence, from economics and sociological traditions, that we have a free rider problem in Anglophone systems. We know that firms underinvest in skills. This is a long-term problem. 30 years in this country, Andre Crack, formerly of this parish, as part of the NEPI process, imported the idea of the low-skill equilibrium to explain why the South African economy didn't demand the skills it needed. And though the details have changed, I would argue that we still have large elements of that. People are not expressing demand in an unproblematic way. We need to understand why firms don't always demand what we think they should demand. But then we have to ask more fundamental educational questions, as Volker was stressing. So in high-performing economies, skill systems have a stronger educative purpose. They're about the whole occupation, the whole qualification, the whole person. They're not about these atomized skills. And so simply combining modules in any pattern or moving to micro-credentials has serious implications. It's not just a knowledge question, but it's a moral question about the formation of the worker as a person and a citizen. And it also, in the workplace, equips them less well to be productive. It doesn't give them a strong understanding of the current tasks and how to respond to change and turbulence in the workplace now. It certainly doesn't equip them to move to new occupational areas as they are likely to be expected to do in their lives. It makes them passive when they need to be much more active participants in their own careers, in their own living, working and learning. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Please remember to your rally voice for the people at the back.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick up Simon's idea around this holy grail of demand-led and unpack it a little bit with some of my inputs. And I think that I want to add into the discussion a lot of the information that we get about our so-called demand studies inform how we plan, inform how we allocate skills funding. It also gives us strong reasoning to make decisions about what young people should know and what young people should be able to do. And Simon has articulated quite clearly that a lot of the methodology that we're using to surface that demand is from employer information. And he's given multiple examples about the problems with employers actually being able to articulate what current needs there are, how valid those articulations could be, and how problematic it is to actually utilize it to look at future. I just wanted to throw 2 points about that in the mix, is that The Economist is currently doing a global employer survey, okay? And in that employer survey at the moment, of participating in their advisory group, they have found in the UK, Simon, only 25% of executives could articulate what the impact of the green transition on their business could be. In 2020, they found that 82% of businesses in the UK could not articulate what the impact of the green transition would be in terms of their work roles. I have to say, I don't know where my colleague is, Brazil fared much better in their Economist survey, actually. Their employees were better able to articulate. The other anomaly that seemed to, employers couldn't. As soon as when employers were asked questions around how they saw the skill needs, they reverted to technological needs. They equated it to change in technology, okay? So and largely, and then when I reflected on that finding from that survey, made me think that's often what's happening in our skills processes as we talk about the just transitioning. We talk about a shift of technology, and then we talk about the skills that will be needed to implement that technology, okay? And then we start to plan around that. So the kind of technological need, the educational need is driven by the change, only by the change in technology, and not largely by what kind of skills and knowledge will somebody need to live, work, and learn, okay? And how will they function within a stream of work? How will they be able to work? Employers overwhelmingly in the survey articulated that 81% of jobs needed in the green transition will be high-skilled, okay? And they weren't, and all of those jobs were technological. No, the survey is not, if you're looking for the survey, I haven't. So I just wanted to break apart this notion of how problematic it is to use demand-led as a holy grail as we're doing skills planning, okay? Most of that demand-led information comes from economic modeling, okay? The economic models that we are producing are using current value chains, okay? Current framing of jobs. Because no one in the world yet has an economic model that can actually ask, how should the jobs here change? If we applied a lens of changing regulation to make the jobs here more sustainable, how will the jobs change? If we changed the risk factors here, okay? And we eliminated all the environmental risks, how will the jobs change? If we introduced innovation, how will the jobs change? Because that's the only way. It's an iterative process to work out how jobs will change, okay? Because there are multiple ways these jobs are going to change. And understanding the green transition, understanding the impact of innovation, the impact of technology change, the impact of ecological risk, the impact of changing regulation on jobs. It's an iterative process then to work out what impact that's going to have on how jobs will change. The other issue with why understanding demand for future skills and what people need to know is so complex is because the demand-driven methodology makes us focus on the end, okay? We need so many of hydrogen fuel technicians. I'm always going to these hydrogen workshops. We need so many hydrogen fuel technicians. So hydrogen fuel technicians becomes the focus of what the system needs. But hydrogen fuel technicians cannot transition the system. So what the demand process does, it helps us to or it forces us to focus on the end without actually understanding the transitioning process, okay? So we're missing a lot of the process. Secondly, is that it gives us this idea of a full occupation. It doesn't produce information on how the occupation is changing. What kind of knowledge changes will there be? That's why the weakest part of our system at the moment is understanding what's needed in the workplace. What kind of workplace-based learning is actually going to be needed? Okay? Because we're not generating enough information on how the jobs are actually going to change. Is it the tools and the systems of the job? Is it the work processes that are changing? Is it the knowledge that's changing? That needs much more nuanced types of tools and much more careful, iterative articulation of how jobs are changing, rather than we need a supply and demand, and we'll make decisions about how we will allocate skills money on these large-scale supply and demand studies. I'll stop there, Steph.
You're last again, Hela. I'm not sure why, but
It's okay, I got up the earliest this morning. I'm sure that's why. I drove from Golden Gate this morning at 4:30. Yes.
And thank you for doing that.
Okay, so I'm going to connect, I think, with quite a few of the things that have been said here, starting with Ken's question about the types of knowledge that can become possible in this kind of a process model that is opened up there, and then Prisha's last point about work and processes, work processes, how they're changing, and the kinds of knowledges that are necessary for supporting those changing work processes. And then Volker's point about, what are we loading the educators with, and how can we expect the educators to be the ones to carry all of this? And I'll just draw a little bit also from our experience again of working in this particular project over time. And the first issue is the issue of knowledge, and who is producing knowledge, and how does the knowledge actually make its way into the education systems and into the communities that are actually needing to use this knowledge to live better and to work better and so on. And there's a big disjuncture there in our national system, because we're producing a lot of new science. I told you that the Water Research Commission had spent millions of rands on these very well-researched rainwater harvesting practices that were fantastic for the farmers, but there was no way that they could get to that knowledge, right? So there's a problem there. So the new knowledge that's being produced is not making its way into education, and in a lot of the sustainability research that we've been looking at, some people are even saying in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, for example, it takes 10 years for new science to make its way into education. So there's a disjuncture there, okay? So then that's the first thing. The second thing is that when that knowledge arrives, it arrives in these big packs of alienating discourse, okay? And it's inaccessible to the college lecturers, the communities, and the people who are most in need of working with this knowledge, the students as well. So there's a second issue there, which is the access process. How do you produce access to these, very valuable knowledge resources that are being produced by our scientific institutions? And in our project, we went through a whole process of simplifying that knowledge and centering it around the practices, the knowledge that is necessary for the practices, and trying to make that more visible, and then also produce it in mediation tools that could be easily used to the level of a postcard. And if you could get the postcard on a rainwater harvesting practice that you were interested in, you could then track from that postcard all the way to the detailed scientific information about that. We have made posters in isiXhosa and in English, because there's also the issue of language in these kinds of processes and so on. And that then raises the question about the third dimension, is that how do people use knowledge? And what demand do they actually have for knowledge? And how do we know what that is? Okay, and that is where you find then a very big disjuncture between what's being put into the curriculums and what is actually being asked for in the context. So the curriculums are out of date in these colleges. We found, for example, and it wasn't only in this college, but in a number of agricultural colleges around the country that they were not teaching anything about rainwater harvesting and conservation. They were teaching large-scale irrigation. And of course, that's good if you're going to be a monoculture crop farmer planting big sugarcane fields or big millet fields or whatever. You need that irrigation knowledge. So it's not that you don't need it. It's just that it's inadequate for the full scope of the types of farmers that we have in the country. So there's a curriculum innovation process that is necessary. And that is not just in documents, it's also in the minds of the academics that are doing the teaching. So they have to learn this new knowledge themselves, and there's almost no support for them to do that. So there's that level of challenge as well. And then there's the actual process of putting this knowledge to work and how you actually support that. And in our case, we found the demonstration projects or demonstration sites or demonstration processes extremely important for the vocational education because they allowed people to see the knowledge actually in practice and then to be able to duplicate that or expand it into their own contexts. And it actually became one of the main mediating tools in the whole community. People kept on making these new demonstration projects around new practices that they wanted to try out with the new knowledge resources that they could now access that had come from the scientific institutions. And to hold all of this together, we've also started to look at the relationship between stabilized knowledge, in other words, the knowledge that is coming and is very well kind of packaged, and possibility knowledge, which is how you can turn that into agentive movement. So how you shift stabilized knowledge into possibility knowledge, and then how that transforms in the actual landscape of practice. So those then produce the conditions in which the knowledge comes alive and eventually becomes useful to people and can actually help to move a social context forward or in a different way. So it takes all of this, right, to break the knowledge problem that I mentioned when I started with. And so to hold all of this together, we've established what we call a learning network. It's called the Umvoto Bobomi Learning Network. People gave it the name Water is Life. And they named this learning network and started to be part of it. And we've used this learning network as the place in which to share this whole kind of knowledge process, knowledge translation process, knowledge project. And it's so incredible because we started that into the year 2014, and this learning network is still ongoing. Lulu will tell you every single day there's 4 or 5 posts. People are posting new information, they're asking questions, they're sharing knowledge. They continue to do so. And I wanted to read you this little quick quote it's actually from a passage in one of the interviews in Sydney's PhD, but it actually sums up, I think, what Ken was talking about. It says, and for me again, and this is from a farmer, the farmer is saying this, and for me again, with my group in the learning network, whenever we have problems, we just post the probing questions there, and they're talking about the online learning network, and whoever is there knows the answer, then they can answer. And fortunately for us, we even have academics there. We've got farmers, we've got extension officers, so we will find a solution, sorry, this is not a good place to read it from, to whatever problems you have. And it's diverse because some are from different universities. Fort Hare is there, and other agricultural colleges are there. So it's rare that you don't find any answer to what you want to know. So what this is actually, it's about a distributed system of knowledge resourcing, if I could call it that. And that the learning network then enables that to happen. And it takes the pressure off the individual extension officer who is, tasked with all of this new knowledge that they have to carry into the field. It also takes some of the pressure off the lecturers, but it also is helping the lecturers to learn this new knowledge, and we've seen that over the years as well. So it's a very kind of important process that we, I think, need to understand better if we want our skill systems to work, because the assumptions are just too simplistic. The assumption of top-down transfer is way too simplistic for the complexity of the type of learning that we actually need if we want to work on social change in our communities and just transitioning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hela. So I think that's given us all a lot to think about. I know that we have a lot of expertise in the room as well, and people who come to this issue from a different set of concerns and problems. And so I want to now throw it open to the floor. And I want to invite you either to ask a question to any of the panelists on one of the issues that they've raised, or to share your experiences and insights or concerns in relation to this issue of using the idea of skills ecosystems to think about building the skills that we need to support the just transition that we are hoping to build, or the problems that you're facing in using this idea in your research or in your practical interventions. So I'm gonna throw it open to the audience for questions or comments. I don't have the online in front of me, so Kate, can you let me know what the questions are from the online audience, and then we will also relay those to the panelists. Anyone like to kick us off with a comment or a question? Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction. Very, very interesting. I want to ask a question which is relating the beginning of the session with the end of the session. Yeah. So the end of the session, like Prisha was asking for work-based learning or how to bring the knowledge into the institutions. Yeah. And the beginning was about the modeling with the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension. So I'm searching actually in the model, the education part of the model. So the horizontal part, I would say it's a sociological thinking. The vertical, I would say it's a political thinking. So we are combining the meso on the horizontal with the macro on the vertical. But where is this micro level in the model? Where you just was talking about at the end, which is for me the educational part of the model. So on the picture, I was not able to see it, even not in the living, learning and working part, because the working part was just about jobs. It was about the outside. It was not about working, it was about jobs. And the learning was about general intellect. It was not about competence on the workplace. And so I actually search this micro level in the model of the ecosystem. Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Michael. Is there another question or comment before I give it back to the panelists?
Yeah, so my question came up as I was writing on my yellow card, which is where are the spaces where this 45-degree I suppose planning, thinking, communication is, I find it really interesting. I suppose in the context of feeling like our organization is an organization that would operate in that space. So it's very clear to me how the horizontal organizations, people operating on the ground, where a lot of that horizontal learning and planning is going on, and then of course the vertical. But when you think about the 45-degree, aside from higher education institutions, where do we see the actions and activities emerging and decisions occurring, in those spaces?
Okay. Yael. And sorry, people online, I do apologize, we don't have a roving mic. We actually had not planned this to be a hybrid seminar. We wanted people to come to the office, but there was a lot of demand from people who were unable to travel to get here. So that's why we did stream the panel, and they will respond and capture the questions in their response. But I'm sorry for the people online that it's probably hard for you to hear the questions.
I don't know, maybe it's a question and maybe it's a comment, I'm not sure yet. But what I think I see, and I'm new to this, so I might got it wrong. What I see is three levels of very different types of analysis. One is analytical analysis of the systems that are involved in skill formation. And that is coming because the current system is very fragmented. And the more system you've got, the more difficult it is to develop relationship, but that's what you're trying to to do. In this analytical level, there are two types of relationship. There's the vertical, which is power relations, where you've got clear dominant actors. You put the state, I don't know where it's capital, but I assume that somewhere capital will come in. And then within the horizontal, again, I'm sure that there are verticalities as well within the horizontal. And the question is, what's the domination for? So you go to the second level, second part of your analysis, which is the education question or the knowledge question. I agree that the education, it's the knowledge questions. Because the question, for me as a curriculum theorist, the question is how the first level of analysis will help me to answer the question which Heinle asked, what goes into the curriculum and what doesn't go into the curriculum. And so that's the, and different actors are involved, but they don't have power. I mean, one of them is standing in front of you. She tried to change what the state is trying to do, I don't know how many times, and they listen very well and do nothing about it. So that the verticality is what the verticality is very important, but we also have to understand that people with power talking to other people with power still will not have influence. So we need to understand where is the influence, where is the really influence. And the third part of the analysis is normative, which is really, you want a just society, there's a whole new field of energy and development of new occupations and all of that you want to bring into this model. So maybe my question is where is the anchor? In Marxism, it was in economics, even if in the more kinder and gentle form of Marxism, there was economic power that in the end, in the last instance, through a long road, determines what happens in the end, in education and in knowledge. Where is the anchor in your model? Or there isn't an anchor, and therefore you can only test the anchor or the power by taking the model to different contexts, and in different contexts, the power relations change.
Okay, thanks. Panel, can I throw one more at you before you, I've got another question here. It seems like only the people in the front are asking questions. Oh good, I've got one towards the back. I was hoping it wasn't because people at the back couldn't hear anything at all. Let's go to the back and then I'll come to you, Wendy, and then I'm going to hand back to the panelists.
I must be honest, I've got quite many comments and many questions. But I'll just ask two only for now. On Heine's presentation, I just wanted to understand, I mean, you guys have been doing these things for quite some time now around the whole science and in different communities. And I just wonder is do you think the informants that you guys have access to are adequate, you know? I mean, do you think what you're getting is sufficient? You know, that's what I want to ask. And I also just want to make a comment that echoes what Michael said earlier on. The fact is we know already that what we're trying to do, who are we doing it for? You know, the who aspects of it, we already understand that, like I think Simon was indicating, you've got the employers, and their voice sort of dominates when we talk about skills anticipation, you know, and then the voice of the workers continues, you know, to go down and down and down. And from where I'm seated, I think this is just a manifestation of what we already knew before, that what is pulling the most, what is influencing the most in here again, it is those sort of, the fact that all these things, all these debates, to a certain extent, are still caught up or captured in colonial thoughts, they're still captured in your neoliberalism, they're still captured in global capitalism, you know. And then it does actually bring me to I wonder to what extent are we, in a South African context now, going to have a situation where some people will be bold enough, you know, about certain issues that continues, you know, to leave us in a situation where we continue to find ourselves in, whereby we think we are not responsive, or we think we are unable to respond. You know, and yeah, that's basically what I want to comment about. Thank you.
And last one for this round.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel. It was really, really interesting. I just wanted to build a little bit on what Jane was saying about change. So how does this model allow you to help deal with uncertainty going forward? Because it is got to be a little bit predictive. And understanding if there are shifts, where in that model is the best place to implement change or to try and help the change happen quickly and responsibly to the system.
Okay. Panelists, I am going to allow you democratically to decide who wants to come up. I am going to ask you, unfortunately, to come up and give your responses, just for the benefit of the... Can they sit? They can be heard. Oh, wonderful. You don't have to get up. Okay. It'll pick them up. Okay, people online, you can holler to Kate if you are struggling to hear the panelists. And who wants to jump in first?
I guess. I'd like to attempt a response to the points you raise. Particularly, where is the anchor?
And remember, the people at the back don't have a mic.
Okay. So you asked, where is the anchor? My initial response to that is that the anchor is in the study of the complex processes of hegemony. Hegemony is economic, political, ideological, technological now. Okay? So it's in those complex processes. Okay? That, in fact, is more holistic Marxism than the Marxism of the 19th century. That's the first thing. And therefore it raises the question, and Gramsci didn't talk about counter-hegemony, but I will use the term today. Yeah? What do we mean by an effective, progressive counter-hegemony? Because you're always working in contested relationships. So what does that mean? And that has implications about how far you can pursue the horizontal. You know? Because the world is littered with horizontalisms that didn't survive. Right? So it begs the question that any time that you work on a horizontal and try to develop these spaces and autonomy, you have to negotiate with the vertical, yeah, in order to create permanence.
Yeah.
So that's the first response. Secondly, of course it's normative. We've had long discussions about normative in the last few years. I mean, it was thrown to me as a borderline insult, you're normative. And my response is, who's not? Right? If you care about the world. But then, so the sense starts out as normative, because it's actually about system building. Right? But actually the discussions we've had over the last few days, it's developed analytical capacities. So for example, I've taken off the qualifier of collaborative horizontalities. I talk about horizontalities. What's their condition? I've taken away facilitating verticalities. What's their complex condition? So we're trying to develop the analytical side of the SEM, yeah, through these discussions over the last few days. It's more from one version to another. And then thirdly, as it develops the analytical framework rather than the normative framework, so it becomes an analytical tool or framework you can apply to different situations. And therefore, what I'm thinking about now in response to this discussion is that the context becomes the actual ecosystem dynamic within the 45 degrees. So it can be applied endlessly, well, if it's working, endlessly to different contexts to give you different levels of explanatory power. And one more question about uncertainty. Okay, look, we all would love to live in a certain world, right? But we know there is uncertainty, and we have to work with it. It seems to me that ecosystem thinking, even in its borrowings from the natural world, do have built in this idea of uncertainty, because you can only kind of predict the next outcome at very best. It's not a static model; it's a constantly evolving model. So I think it has an integral capacity to deal with uncertainty, and that's why, in fact, at the end of the day, the explanatory power is probably more conjunctural, of analysing the moment, rather than simply having the kind of predictive power that traditional Marxism had.
Can I just add one point to that uncertainty, and then I'm sure you'll pick up the knowledge question.
Loud, Pusha.
Oh, sorry. I thought I'd add one point, but Ken, feel free to, because it's actually your point, not mine, that we've been talking about. I was actually, when Wendy spoke about, we've been talking about that relationship between the vertical and the horizontal as subordinate, dominant, subordinate spaces, and how that changes and moves over time in the transition. And your question actually took me there, in how you draw that arc of dominant and subordinate spaces between the vertical and the horizontal, but we can chat more about it. I don't know if that works for you, Ken. That's how I thought this was.
Absolutely, but that only produced the idea that any interaction across the arc produces a dominant subordinate relationship. But then the question is, what if you're in the subordinate, which we invariably are? What do you do to try to assert that relationship on the vertical? And that's now then a political mediating strategy. Just one more thing, just to respond to somebody else. Where's education? It has to be theoretically in the 45-degree zone. That's where it is. The question, how does it function inside that? And what's the spread of it in terms of its vertical and horizontal relationships? And how that relates to pedagogy and existing understanding and expert knowledge is really the stuff should be discussing within TVET.
Yeah.
I can speak to that a bit more. I think in just from, and
As
you
loud
can,
as you can, please.
Sorry, and I'm drawing a lot just on this, extended case, because I like to work from where I can understand things actually happening. So in our experience, the educational work occurs in that exactly the 45-degree space, because that's actually also where the educational institutions hold a particular type of role, because, for example, a vet college will implement a policy, right, a curriculum policy coming from DHET, and then they are kind of working with that policy in order to offer education to young students and so on and so on. And then they are either enabled or constrained by that policy and the way it's functioning. So, for example, in this case, they have a DHET policy on how to, develop curriculum for agricultural extension officers, the next generation. But they lack practice-based engagement in that training program, the way that the curriculum realizes itself. Okay, so that's the one kind of educational thing is these actual education institutions and what they do, and then what they do is they work on curriculum, as we know, and then that curriculum also needs to be transformed, as we've discussed already. So there's a curriculum transformation process that's also going on in that space, and that is also then assisted by the other interactions that are possible if you can bring the verticalities to be more facilitating. Okay, so there's also a dynamic to the notion of the verticalities. And that's what we need more than anything else, is for our verticalities to become more facilitating in those spaces, so that so that those institutions, educational institutions, can actually be more relevant and functional in the contexts that they are meant to operate. You know, in short, that would be it. But and there's a lot of things that come along with this in this particular model, because we also found it was a curriculum review, this relationship to the education policy that was out of sync. There's also the issue of the theory and practice that Volker also raised, and the ecosystem model allowed for more engagement with practice. So it actually helped the theory-practice relationship, because the demonstration plots were taking place in the college and in the communities, and there was a stronger relationship then between the students and the communities, and the students had more sites for practical, so that relationship shifted in the educational space. But there was also an important, another form of education, which was actually public education. So that was done through community radio programming, and the college lecturers and the students contributing to community radio programming and connections with the farmers' associations in and out of the college, such that eventually the college changed its curriculum review panel and its way of reviewing curriculum to include members from this learning network that had emerged. So there was then a shift in dynamic in the way in which the curriculum development started to take place in the college, which is still going on to this day. That curriculum panel now works and, you know, continues with its work. And it's really important, because when you look at what's being taught in the curriculums, it's extremely dated. It's really dated. Some of the agricultural textbooks that are being used are from 1930 still. So you know, so how do you insert different educational thinking is, of course, the question there. So that's the question about the education, and there's a lot to be said about that still. The point about who are we doing this for, I think, is a very important point. It relates to the point about anchor. You know, who are we doing this for? And it's for both the next generation of young people who are being educated in these institutions, or should I say miseducated in these institutions. So it's for those young students, and then it's also for the people in and around these institutions that need to be served by them, that are not being served by them. So I think for me that's who it's for, you know. So it is actually for, I guess, better education, but definitely for the next generation of young people to be better educated in order to be more responsive to the challenges of their societies. You know, and you can see these challenges in any context, you know, not only in the context that I was working in. So I think, yeah.
Okay, three quick reflections on this. I mean, let's start with the question of scale. What's not apparent in what we've put up is two different approaches to scale, although they have commonalities. In Ken's model, a use of Bronfenbrenner adapted with a series of scales in that, and then questions about the relationship between scalar levels. And then in our book, much more a Bhaskarian view of lamination there. But let me try and illustrate that a bit. That then takes us into the education question, is that then we were trying to look at different scalar levels, but we're also trying to look at particular education, learning, to work aspects, debates in the book. And so we, you know, and there are many of those, but we chose 4 of those to try and illustrate how we were working with this in an educational context. Focus talked a bit about the vocational teachers space. So if we're thinking about these things and we're talking about changing curriculum and new needs, and we're also thinking about the knowledge role of teachers, as Focus talked about, particularly in a world where you know, the knowledge authority of the teacher has been changed by technology. So we explored that question of what does it mean to be a vocational teacher, and particularly when we're not just talking about the colleges, but we're talking about these other spaces, and including vocational learning that's not mediated by any teacher. So, you know, the YouTube example I mentioned earlier. We looked at the space of some of these learning networks in the rural subsistence economy, but also in the informal economy of Gulu, and the extent to were people learning. And part of the answer to the who is this for? Yes, there's an analytical version of saying how the system works, but clearly the normative version that the learning networks become spaces where people take more control of their learning. And so from looking at what was happening in Alice, people in Gulu then tried, for instance, youth cafes, which when COVID hit, they moved onto a radio program where a group of youth would come in and talk about the issues they were facing in their lives and get callers in and have a debate which the academics were helping to moderate and support, that tried to talk about these things. That then took us onto a third dimension, which was the role of universities in particular in this. So although we talk about skill systems, and we tend to talk about the vocational institutions, that the universities, so we've heard about Rhodes and Fort Hare playing a key role there, but Gulu is very much taking a reimagined form of the development university in a part of northern Uganda that had been racked by a very nasty civil war for decades, a city which had been based then on humanitarianism and all the donors coming in for that, but how did it get post-humanitarianism, post-civil war? What would the economy look like? And the university, knowing that there was very little formal sector, so how did it engage with organic agriculture, with the informal sector in different ways, in a way that was all kind of new for them, because this was the reality of their communities, but it wasn't in any of the great theories about how a university should be triple helix or quadruple helix or whatever. You know, so they were making a practice of being a development university. And the fourth aspect was, you know, a classic education and work sociology question of the transition into the labour market for young people. And looking at that and how that was mediated effectively in some ways, but not effectively mediated in multiple ways by various decisions. For instance, where a sectoral expertise was located, and how that played into the realities of the local labour market that it was supposed to be serving, and it wasn't particularly effectively, and all those contradictions that were how the verticalities were coming down on young people trying to navigate their lives and trying to, and educational institutions that were supposed to be working with them. So we did have 4 education questions that then we took out of a myriad of educational questions we could have focused on. And partly that was being responsive. We were a group of 20 academics, and so there was never one view in any meeting we had. And also, we had to respond to COVID, and what were the realities, what were the possibilities of doing research, and we carried on doing research through COVID. You know, many projects finished, we carried on doing it, but we had to adapt methodologies constantly to, there's a lockdown, there's not a lockdown, there's a mini lockdown, you know, yeah.
Okay.
Can I just say?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add.
No,
I mean, not to add into, I think we can move. I just wanted to add that the book, Simon, is available online.
Free?
Free. It's an open access book on that, where you're studying ecosystem. I mean, the project that Simon's been talking to and all of us here have been engaged in. But I also wanted to state that is that our interest in how do we approach skills development is not just about promoting one particular model of skills ecosystems. I think, you know, and Simon flagged that we've been looking at the adaptive skills ecosystems that our colleagues in Australia have been utilizing, the high skills ecosystems that colleagues in the US. So they're different forms. And so just to throw it out there, so if you're interested in it, you're not thinking about that where, you know, there's only one model, that there are different ways that people are using it. There's some ideas that are core to skills ecosystems, and we've been working with a version of skills ecosystems that resonate with the transitioning context. So, Simon, we were asking, how do we locate transitioning individuals? How do we locate transitioning jobs? How do we locate transitioning? And it became much more difficult in the kind of high skill model that the colleagues in America were utilizing. And it was still, the Australian work around skills ecosystem is still very firm based. It does delve a lot more than the American work into vocational education and intermediate skills development, but the anchor institutions are largely the firms, or the firm becomes the anchor. And we were, as you can hear from the cases, we wanted a gaze that was much bigger than the firms. So just to throw that there are different kinds of work around skills ecosystems.
I wanted to come back to Michael's question around...
Louder. Louder.
Louder than that?
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to Michael's question about where the education is, and Simon's covered most of it, but I do think it's true. I mean, I certainly personally really grappled with trying to locate it within the model. And in the end, I think, there is no theory of education in the model.
Yeah.
It allows us to locate sites and processes of education, I think, anyway. And so it means that educational activity happens within the institutions on the horizontal, and that means we have to open the black box of those institutions and try and understand the processes within. But I think crucially what it does is it says it doesn't just happen in those institutions, informal processes, informal curricula. It happens in the relationships between those and other actors within the system, across the system. And that's so, I think it is correct to locate it on the 45 in the sense that it is a mediation activity. But you could also locate education really across the entire, and all the different dimensions of education, whether you're talking about curriculum policies, the generation of knowledge that might be happening on the horizontal, but we know, say, from a Bernsteinian framing, we can think about how that gets translated into formalized curriculum and then comes back into the horizontal in a different form, and how, so I think that's where I would locate the educational. But it does mean, I think at one level, all one is saying is education is a lifelong and life-wide process, and what we're trying to do is understand where are the sites of that, and how do you enhance that to improve learning for living, for working, all of those sorts of things. But it means that we still have to bring an educational lens and an educational question and an educational theory into the model. But I don't think you necessarily have to have one. I think there's space within that to bring a range of perspectives.
Okay, Simon wants to make one quick addition before I hand back to the plenary. And I just want to actually provoke, Hela, would you disagree with that? You can think about that. Because it seemed to me that in your presentation you did have an educational theory embedded in the skills ecosystem model. But maybe I'd be interested in your take on what Volker just said. But Simon.
Okay, so my point is is about knowledge production and where we are in the process of knowledge production here. So one, I would probably characterise this as transdisciplinary, the field of ecosystems, more than interdisciplinary, but that's one we could, but it's certainly not disciplinary is the key thing, and so we have various versions of the ecosystems are coming from different parts of academic traditions and are emphasising certain ways of knowing and thinking about this. And the second part of that is, will it become, is it a theory? Will it become a theory? And I suppose I've been thinking this week about a comparison with the capabilities approach. So the capabilities approach sort of has decided it's not a theory, but it's an approach. And then after about 20 years, one of the key second-generation thinkers in it, Ingrid Robbins, produced a book which says, well, to be capabilities, you've got to have these things. If you don't have these things, it's not capability. Those things that lots of people have. And these things here, you can't have those things and capabilities. Which got significant pushback within that community of what were the boundaries of the topic. And this feels, we're maybe in that stage of knowledge production, after maybe a decade, we have, well, I suppose if we go back, to the earliest work of this 25 years, but it's been quite episodic. It's been sort of in different disciplinary and national spaces, and all the key people have never been in the same room, and never will be. And so kind of, what does that mean for its status as a form of knowledge production?
Thanks, Simon. I want to come back to the plenary, but before I hand over for questions, you've all written on your green card, and you've all written on your yellow card. So while you're thinking of the questions that you want to ask, or the comments and interventions and knowledge sharing that you want to make, which you can do by putting up your hand, or by chatting in the chat, you can also, there's a third vehicle open to you, and that is picking up your orange card. And on your orange card, you can write any questions that you have, any concerns that you have, any ideas or experiences that you would like to share. So your orange card is an open card for you to put up anything that you think you want to share with the research community, with the implementation community. I think we've got both researchers and policy implementers in the room. So you can say which space you're coming from or which space you're talking to, or you can just share an idea or share a question. So while so you can also put up your hand and do that, and you can do both. It's very democratic here. So write down your thoughts, write down your questions, write down your concerns, write down your ideas on your orange card. But also, please, I'm throwing it open now. Kate, do we have any questions from the online people? Shame, maybe they got discouraged by not being able to hear. More questions, comments, suggestions, ideas, concerns, engagements. I am going to ask Anthony Giver to, as someone who is doing a lot of work in this space, to share his thoughts on their work and in response particularly to what's come up from the panel today. And everyone else who is sitting there quietly, just remember that you may equally be picked on. So start thinking about, it's not that democratic, okay? I said it was democratic, it is quite democratic, but there are limits. So you may also be called upon. So this is your warning. Anthony.
Thanks. So I've been tempted to try and get some input, but I've been still trying to formulate in my head how to structure it. I mean, I think that one of the practicalities on the ground, particularly in the kind of context that we're working in, is that you've got, I mean, these are, because they're so place-based, there's so many dynamics that you're dealing with in different. So, I mean, the examples that have been used in the Eastern Cape are going to be very distinct from the examples you might use in other sort of local environments. So the work that we're doing, particularly with particular colleges and private sector and government, is to look very much at kind of more industrializing spaces. Some of them are industrializing, some of them are reindustrializing. There's new things happening, and particularly in terms of the green economy and just transition, there's a whole lot of work happening at these local levels. And what we're seeing in those sort of contexts is that your power relations are quite different in some ways, because so we're quite expedient about these things in some ways, because we're trying to create jobs, right? And we need jobs now. And all the arguments around knowledge and building of knowledge and structuring programs take time, because we know the skill system doesn't move very quickly, you know, and so we're caught in this continuous balance between not wanting to shortcut the process of skilling and developing knowledge and getting young people on a pathway towards, on a learning journey, let's say, versus the immediacy of getting them into employment and income generation. And how do you kind of, you know, balance these two things out within those ecosystems? So you have to, in a way, look at the relationships and the power structures somewhat more expediently in some ways, and say, how do we leverage off the capacity of that ecosystem to grow opportunities now and lay a foundation for potentially for sustainability into the future? Because you're trying to build very complex relationships, and there's a lot of mistrust. There's not a lot of trust between the private sector, government, institutions, and various, you know, and communities that we're working with. Now, communities hold a lot of power because they hold private sector and government accountable, right? And if they're feeling hard done by, they will react, you know? And we've seen that a lot in various of these localities. So on the private sector point of view, when we talk to them, it's very much about how do you manage the dynamics of that local ecosystem to the extent where, on the one hand, it becomes easier for you to do business, right? And you need private sector to be able to do business because they create the jobs. Right? But on the other hand, also has benefit in terms of their business being able to grow and succeed, because then you've got a lot more capacity in those local ecosystems to service that business and to, particularly from a value chain, supply chain point of view, so that you can create a greater ecosystem for economic opportunity that's more inclusive. But on the other hand, you've got the issues around skilling. And the issues around skilling, as to Precious' point, it's often, you know, it's led by demand. Right? It shouldn't ideally be that case, but unfortunately, when you're trying to create jobs now, you're going to look for where's the demand. And you're going to see how you can unlock that demand as quickly as possible, so that you can get young people skilled and into workplaces for workplace learning and for absorption. So we're going to work with, on the demand side, with SMEs who have the potential to create jobs. We're going to help them to grow. We're going to link them into value chains. And we're going to do a lot of work on the demand side around opening the markets, linking them into these, creating more equitable access to opportunities for these SMEs. But we're also going to provide them with a labor pool that's skilled, better skilled than what they have at the moment, because they're typically taking people off the street and there's no formal training happening in those businesses. So now we're trying to change the culture of those businesses to also become spaces that can train and employ young people in a more structured manner in partnership with our team at college. So there's a bit of a, this is where the expediency comes in, because we need the jobs. So we're going to grow the jobs now, we're going to train for those jobs now, we're going to place young people there, let them get the work experience, and some of them, hopefully majority of them, get absorbed. Others go into further learning, so we actually find a lot of them jump onto an apprenticeship or learnership opportunity without us having to do anything, right? And that's their path. Others will come into an entrepreneurship or an incubation program at the college that we're setting up. And, you know, and then we'll go and hopefully become, you know, one day we'll actually create jobs. But the big thing now is that we want as many of those small businesses in those township communities, in those local ecosystems, to become job creators. And that's what we have to do. So now, so you have to deal with the power dynamics locally. On the one hand, working with your larger private sector partners who hold the might of those value chains and those supply chains, right? And you need to get them to break those. You need to get them to dig deeper into them and find these township businesses, and we hope to do that. On the other hand, we need to work with communities and the private sector to build the trust that the private sector will say, no, we will take businesses from those townships and we will work with them. And then we have to work with those communities themselves to grow more of a sense of their responsibility to train and employ young people. But they don't know they need those skills until they need them. So they have to be, these businesses have to be growing. So I think it's just a case of really balancing out what are the broader objectives of building that ecosystem and bringing all of that collective capacity of the different role players within that ecosystem together to build a longer-term solution around sustainability and just transition and that, versus the immediate issues of how can we unlock jobs and create demand for those skills.
Thanks, Ant.
And I think that's just the
Thank you. Now, I'm just giving advanced warning. We've got a number of people in the room who come from SETAs, Sectoral Education and Training Authorities, for those of you who don't know what they are, and they're likely to be picked on next, because I am interested in understanding their perspectives and their take from a sectoral perspective on these issues. But my next victim is Tamo. Because he's visiting us here from Brazil, and and he's doing some research in Brazil. And so, just any thoughts or reflections on what you've heard today or on the Brazilian experiences?
Sure.
Rally voice.
Immediately, what came to mind as I was listening to is that so much of the conversation today, even when thinking about educational institutions, is coming back to Tibet institutions. I think perhaps we should look further back. I'm not saying our schools should be preparing students for skills, but perhaps that orientation of what lies ahead perhaps need to happen earlier. Because that's when young people will be perhaps leaving their high school education with a much better understanding of what the world of work looks like. And this is something that we are discussing in Brazil. There is a deliberate attempt to create, I wouldn't say vocationalization of high school education, but more of a career professional orientation in high school education. Even when people might go and pursue four-year universities, they will have a better sense of what kind of academic disciplines I would go into, because that's where future lies. So that's kind of one part I'm thinking, that to what extent one should be really thinking of education and learning prior to the Tibet marker. And the second thing was, as there was a question about demand, I kept on thinking, demand is so often seen as an economic construct, but it's really a political construct. What kind of future we envision is implied, who is visioning or envisioning. So in that way, demand is very much a political construct, and that helped me understand much of this. Thank you. I won't repeat that one anymore.
No. You're free now. Any other comments or questions from the plenary? Yes, good. We have the seaters took up on my challenge.
Before you pick on us. Okay, good morning, everybody. So, in my view, is that we are producing research, but are we considering the new generation? Because in the new generation, there's a different way or approach that they expect education to be articulated to them. So, it's something that we, the panel, can take a bite on it in terms of what is the approach or the new approach in terms of how the education system and the world of work looks like for the future. Because the Gen Zs don't operate the same way that we operate. So there's a different way, there's a different thinking from their side. And then my other input is on the research that we're producing. I think we've produced a lot of research as researchers, but like what my colleague here said, that sometimes we produce but it's not implemented. What is it that we can do to influence the policy makers and the decision makers for them to consider our research outputs in order for it to be legislated? As SETAs, yes, we do produce research for what you call this, for our employers. However, you cannot stop there with our employers. It needs to be a national drive. What is it that we can do in support with us as well as SETAs in order to make sure that it is implemented, because often than not, it is implemented at a later stage, and then it becomes old news in terms of the education system. So we are forward as research, but implementation it's a bit slow from the other side. And by the time we produce the curriculums, it's like 10 years behind in terms of the education system. So what is it that we can do together to make sure that at least the research that we produce is sort of like implemented at a faster pace, and so that it is more impactful and it will create those jobs or entrepreneurs or business people that are inside the business. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Panelists, quick responses. You can again select your order. And it's not compulsory to speak. Volker.
So I think the question of schooling and basic education is a really, really important one, and it is kind of the elephant in the room, because any good skills system should sit on top of a really good basic education system. I don't know whether the solution is to try and vocationalize. I would say, I would agree with you, maybe one could introduce certain things in it, but really what you're wanting is for people to develop the fundamental skills that they can then build on, the knowledge and all of those sorts of things. And we have a serious problem in South Africa because 2/3 of our, no, 3/4 of our education system is effectively dysfunctional. And so you are building on very, very loose foundations. And that is always going to be a problem. And we tend to kind of locate the problem in the skills system, in the colleges and that, but they can only work with the students that are coming through the foundational system. So I agree, we have to address that as well. I think in terms of the model, though, I think, you know, it could actually, schools are part, it doesn't have to be, you know, it doesn't have to be a tertiary model, I think, and so I think that's a good challenge for us. I mean, I personally think, addressing some of your questions around the curriculum, that in the long run, it's really about empowering the local institution to be able to be much more responsive. So the case study that Hayla's been referring to, in that case, because we were talking there about an agricultural college, they have a relative autonomy, and they were able to kind of start inserting things into their curriculum. That is not the case for TVET colleges, because you're talking about national qualifications where the local colleges are not involved in the processes of developing those qualifications, the assessment instruments, all of those things are done at another level. And I think that that is a serious disconnect in that, because your ability to respond to a local ecosystem, if you are not able to even make minor adjustments to the curriculum in relation to new innovation, local needs, local employer preferences, all of those sorts of things, makes it very difficult to be a kind of responsive system. And that then means, again, challenges around how much agency, autonomy, skill resides at that level that enables people to make those kinds of decisions. So we have to strengthen those institutions to be if we are talking about them as sort of local anchor institutions. And that's why I think, coming back to Simon's point, universities in our case studies were able to play that role much more, because they do have that expertise and that autonomy to make some of those and to play that kind of role, which at the moment our college sector doesn't have.
Funny.
Yeah. When it comes to the research and implementation question, I'm going to put two extreme positions and then try and get into the middle. So one is, of course, a lot of research isn't intended to be for implementation. A lot of times, even when you are doing research for policy and implementation, and I know Ken has stories of this, I certainly have, the political moment changes. And so, you know, I've had stuff where we were working, BDG, we're working with them, we're doing research, the minister goes off on something in a speech that staff didn't even know about until it was said. We actually had one of these in Scotland a couple of weeks ago. New Minister of Education, her staff didn't know what she was saying at a party conference until she said it. They still haven't worked out what it meant. It was a new Centre for Teacher Excellence. Well, were in the university? No, not in the university. So were. Who's going to do it? And this last I spoke to officials, they still don't know what's in their head. They haven't managed to get it out of their head. It was just a slogan and a speech. So so that's the extreme there. But obviously, where we are trying to get research, policy and implementation together, it's clearly about trying to, it's a relational process. Where it does work, it's about people coming together, about negotiation, about working how far you can push a radical agenda if that's what you're trying to do with things, how far you've got to take what the minister or senior official wants, how far you can push them. But of course then the policy implementation space is the huge challenge. And we know in the South African case that policies have been better than implementation in every single case. We've had huge challenges. Theorising policy, because of who's involved in the policy process, is relatively easy to control. It's fairly simple to do the intellectual process and the negotiation, relatively easy. Implementing is much messier. And so it's much harder to move through to the implementation.
Any other comments?
Yeah.
Please.
I would also respond to the question about research and implementation, and I think that it's important to also, we talk about it a lot at Real, because we're involved in a lot of research and we work a lot with policy, so we work a lot in that nexus. And we also need to see ourselves as mediators in this space, not only producers of research, and how we mediate the research and how we play, how we support processes of communicating and disseminating the research. Nobody will read a research report. It's as simple as that. I mean, we accept that. Probably our own colleagues. If I send it to Volker and I say, he's still He's got no time to read. Nobody is going to, we know that. We produce really good research reports, but then the question becomes, how do we lift out from this and communicate it? And then who do we need to communicate to? What do we communicate to the different stakeholder groups? And I think that in our role as an intermediary, or in our role as mediators of, mediators within the ecosystem, we need to think about how we mediate the type of research. How do we mediate new knowledge? How do we mediate, they're different. Since I'm looking at the colleagues from PCETA, when we were involved with them, we picked up different bits that went into podcasts, bits that went into policy briefs. I've also worked in a project with Mercita where we produced policy briefs as well as practice briefs. Okay? Didn't change the research, but it's about how we lifted and communicated out of these kind of research projects. Just a thought, sorry. But it's also a thought about how to do it, but also our role as mediators in that space.
Hela.
Yes, I think I also want to speak to that question about research. When Prisha and I started the research on the green skills issues in South Africa and the skills system, our observation was that there were two types of research that were very prominent. One is a macro level kind of policy analysis research, right, which we know very well. So we do large scale studies, we do cross-system analyses, blah, blah, blah. So that kind of research is super important and it must be done, and we need to continue doing it, and there's a lot of it that is being done. And actually most of that research is actually quite good. We have quite good research of that type. Then the second type of research that we noticed was that there was a lot of what I would call micro-level research. And that is research into, for example, the experience and the identity of the workers, or the specific work and learning processes.
Sorry, can I ask you to...
Sorry, okay. Yeah, so the second type of research was very much around micro-level interventions. So it would be, for example, a lot of research around introducing a new green skill into a workplace how people were responding, what knowledge they needed, how they were changing their practice, and so on and so on. Or it would have been about the identities of people that were in transitions. So it was quite micro level. And the problem that we have, I think, in our research system is that we don't have the right types of research that can operate between that macro level and the micro level. So the micro level research is very important, and the macro level research is very important. But it's the in-between space that we are very bad at. And that's the space where you get, as Simon was saying, and Prisha, where you get the translation of policy into practice. So why I was so excited about this particular model was I could see that it offered us that as a possible unit of analysis or way of doing research that could bridge that policy practice gap. So if we can learn more from those types of studies, we would also be able to better interpret the macro level studies, and we would also better be able to support the micro level processes. So I think we need a lot more of that, this kind of in the middle kind of research, if I could call it that. This model of Ken's gives us that kind of unit of analysis because it forces us to look at the verticalities, the policy system. Is it facilitating of what needs to happen on the ground? No, it's not. What are the contradictions? How do we mediate those? How do we get around them? That kind of a question. Then we can look at what's going on at the local level, in the factories and in the workplaces. We can understand the experiences, the learning processes, everything there. But unless we can connect them to the policy system better and to the actual institutional transformations that we need in our institutions at that level, we're also never going to be able to make the progress that we need. So it's that actually that this particular sort of panel thing is about, I think, rather than us doing one type of research and then generalizing it into the policy system as such. And so it's not about that actually. It's actually about really working it out in practice in that intermediate space.
Ken, do you want to comment on this issue, or shall I move on?
I want to respond to Michael.
Okay.
Right, and then just respond to one point of discussion. Michael suggested that the horizontal was sociological, and the vertical political. I think this is really helpful and overcomes a current limitation in the model where I've ascribed political to both dimensions. So let's take Michael's logic, which is a contribution to the model. If we think closely about the nature of civil society, particularly in its collaborative forms, it's social. So you could say civil society is dominated, collaborative civil society should be dominated by social relations. So Michael's concept brings the social to the fore. Now, if the social is foregrounded, then we're able to make distinctions between the political interventions of the vertical state, qualification frameworks, for example, and the constant argument for more socialized forms of learning in the 21st century. So I think his typology of the axis means that that provides us with a means now of thinking more about the social nature of learning and the challenges we face, a more social curriculum, and then a more adaptive curriculum. Which brings me then to the final point about the nature of 45-degree mediation in relation to Haley's point of what I will now call, or have called, the qualities of the middle range. So we think in the scalars, no matter how they're constructed, of the qualities of the middle range. Now we know that the middle range has been hollowed out by neoliberalism, and therefore what we are doing is socially repopulating the middle range. If that is the case, then I want to finish on 3 or 4 reflections. First of all, education thinking lags behind events. It's basically an iron law. Okay. But the condition that we face now is we have got 10 years to effect just transitions if we want to actually save humanity's relationship with the planet. The planet goes on, humanity might not just be on it. Right? We have 10 years. That's our ecological time. 10 years. Now, if that is the case, then one of the problems is, how do you get young people to actually engage in imaginings when they're so cynical, yeah, that they don't believe anything that's told to them? We found this in Grimsby, where fish had gone and nothing else had arrived, right? We could not persuade people, young people, about renewables, because they said, look around you. The main thing we're wanting to do is get out of this place, right? So that really posed the question, how do you actually engage in effective storytelling so that the populations actually, what happens is, in the Gramscian sense, storytelling becomes what he calls the progressive myth. The progressive myth doesn't exist yet, but actually the people can see it. It's something within the grasp, yeah? It's not an absolute utopia, yeah? So the progressive myth is something that can be acted on. It's an imagining, yes, within the time scale that we have. Now, if that is the case, then what kind of systems do we need in order that those imaginings are realised in the curriculum? Here we come to the points about networks, horizontal collaborations, and then, crucially, the spaces for curriculum adaptations at the local level within national frameworks. And while I'm really against policy borrowing, yeah, and I've hammered this here, in terms of international comparison, Finland actually has got this one right. Loose national frameworks, yes, local adaptations by confident professionals working in networks. Now, nobody can become Finland overnight, right? Everything changes within your own conditions. But it seems to me this idea of a facilitating national, which is actually devolving powers, yeah, to the local, and then the agency and confidence of the locality with the role of local actors, and then the strong institutions that are able to actually hold that terrain together.
Thanks, Ken. You have very, very nicely brought us to where I wanted us to be. Now, I'm sure you have all been very anxiously wondering what your pink cards are for. What I'm going to ask you to do on your pink cards now, I'm quite anxious that we finish at 12:15 because Michael told me that not only should you start 15 minutes late, but you should finish 15 minutes early if you want to follow German academic culture. What I want you to do on your pink card is write, what do you think are the urgent priorities? This could be urgent priorities for research, it could be urgent priorities for action, it could be for policy, it could be for funding, whatever space you're in, jot down some key points that you think are urgent priorities that we need to confront in this area, and guys, do try and keep it within the area of education and skills ecosystems, because I know there's a lot of places where we could go on this issue. But yeah, as researchers and policy implementers working in the education and skills space, what are some urgent priorities from your perspective? And then I'm going to hand over to my panelists, and I'm going to give them a minute each to answer the same question, to give us what their perspective is on this issue. It doesn't have to be the biggest priority, but just some key things that face you wherever you are. Are you a researcher? Are you a donor? Are you a intermediary body like a CETA? Are you a intermediary body like someone who's trying to get ideas across, like Rene? Are you a implementer like Anthony? Wherever you are, what are some urgent tasks that you think face you? So that's what I'm going to ask the panelists to comment on. I'm going to give them a very short time each, and all of the rest of you in the meantime write it up on your cards, and we are going to put them all up in their different categories over lunch so that you can read what the rest of the room has to say on the 4 questions that are posed to you today. So, who wants to go first? Simon.
I think it kind of links back to what Ken was just saying. What I think the big challenge is about action. But how do we get to action? and it's about narratives that can lead to action. It's being able to have the grown-up debate. Certainly in Britain, you can't have the grown-up debate at the moment because short-term electioneering is driving everything. And we have hard choices, and we need to make sure that people aren't left behind in dealing with those hard choices. So getting a collective view of how we move forward, and education clearly has to be part of that process. So it's not just about what skills are just energy transition, but it's how does education participate in and then build on a national conversation that's needed urgently to lead to the action in the time window that Ken's talking about.
Who's next? Volker.
I'm going to go with your invitation for us to think about rallies and just go, Amandla!
Oh, wait.
Thank you. Because that is the key thing, isn't it? It's power to the people. And we've kind of, I think that's really where the big challenge lies as well, is the things that we have been talking about have been about trust, building trust, networks of professional collaboration, organic intellectuals, change agents, mediators. You know, if we look at the projects where we found sort of really good examples of practice, there have been people in those spaces who have been able to, in various ways, work with power, against power, and I think analytically we need to work more on thinking about that within the model. But I also think it's our biggest challenge in terms of taking some of this forward, because you know, the reason why policies don't get implemented is partly because they're not being implemented by people because people don't, you know, have the power to do that. And so we need to kind of take some of that power back at the local level, and it has to be everyone in the system, across the system, from the teachers in the colleges to the people in the seaters. Everyone kind of needs to see themselves as an activist acting in that mediation space.
Who's next? Hilla.
I'll just be short. I only have one point, I think, and it's really an issue for all of us, and that is that we have to somehow get out of the skills system and its inertia, because it is failing really the next generation and the next generation of young people again. So we have to get different ways of thinking about skills development. We can't continue with the old approaches that are so stuck, and somehow we have to unstick and find other ways of thinking about skills and skills development. That's it.
Ken.
Yes. If all of us are smarter than any one of us, then the future is clouded, not competitive. And it is also the case that civil society is intellectually and politically ahead of the political party. That is undoubtedly the case. And also actually ahead of educational orthodoxy. So, the 45-degree model, yeah, in its horizontalist mode, yes, its advanced horizontalist mode, says educators must bring civil society activists and actors into the educational sphere. We must learn from that and all the new ideas that are springing up all over society in coping with and trying to see beyond the crises, the intersecting crises that we experience. But then we have the educative responsibility for those horizontal movements that provide us with the well springs and the energy to actually have to confront the vertical and those forms of power. And it seems to me that is our 45-degree rule.
And the last word to Prisha.
Yeah, thanks. I think that a priority for me out of this and all of the work around skills and just transitioning is to rethink, or challenge myself to rethink this idea of quick wins. Because it seems to be that everyone in this space is looking for quick wins, and how we think about that differently. Everyone feels this urgency and they're trying to imagine and reimagine a quick win. And I want us to think about how we can design and implement micro-level interventions that we can learn from and that can help us to build a system. But we must keep a commitment that we need to do both. We need to build a system and we need to respond urgently.
I think that's been a really, really rich set of ideas and inspirational to all of us as we leave here this morning. Please drop off your cards here if you have not passed them to the front. Otherwise, we'll come and collect them from the front desks. We are really interested in seeing the ideas that everyone has contributed on these topics. There is lunch downstairs at our offices, so please do join us for lunch, and we look forward to working with all of you moving forward in different roles and capacities. Thank you very much. The video will be on our YouTube site, link, whatever you call it.